Hello, my New Testament students. I thought I'd make a video for you just in case things don't work out this week. We missed last Friday because I couldn't make it there, and then today got iced in, and we'll see about Wednesday. But just in case, and Friday you have winter break. So what I'm going to do in this video, maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes long, I'm just going to give you my little spiel on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Take notes, and then whenever we do get back, if we get back Wednesday, great. If not until next week, we'll just move on from there and try to catch up from there. But here are some basic points you need to know about 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and I'm going to highlight the main thing you got to know about the letters themselves. Okay, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians was written during his second missionary journey. If you remember, where he goes in the first missionary journey is Central Turkey. Right after the Jerusalem Council, he then travels through Central Turkey to revisit those first journey churches, and then he goes up around basically the eastern coast of Greece, Philippi, Thessalonica, eventually Athens and Corinth. Okay, now so he visits Thessalonica on that second missionary journey in roughly 50-51 AD. And it's written about in Acts 17:1 through 9. All of 9 verses we're told about his encounter in Thessalonica. A couple fun historical facts about Thessalonica, though. It was founded in 316 BC by King Cassander of Macedonia, and he named it after his wife Thessaloniki, who happened to be the half-sister of Alexander the Great, which is kind of interesting. And then in 168 BC, Rome came in and conquered Macedonia, divided Macedonia up into 4 different districts, and Thessalonica was the capital of the 2nd district. Almost kind of sounded like Hunger Games here. About 20 years after that, in 149 BC, a Macedonian called Andriscus revolted, and Thessalonica sided with Rome, and Rome won, put down the revolt, and for a thank you, Thessalonica was made capital of the entire region of Macedonia. And then 100 years after that, when Julius Caesar was assassinated, there was the initial civil war between Brutus and Cassius, and then Octavian and Mark Antony. Guess who Thessalonica sided with? Octavian and Mark Antony. Guess who won? Octavian and Mark Antony. Guess who got rewarded? Thessalonica. And for a reward for backing Octavian and Mark Antony, Thessalonica was made a free city, which means it didn't have to pay taxes to Rome, and it was free to govern itself. And then 13 years after that, in 31 BC, when Octavian went to war with Mark Antony, Thessalonica can pick the winners. They sided with Octavian, and when Octavian won and became Caesar Augustus, Thessalonica started the imperial cult where they worshiped the goddess Rome, and they built a temple to Caesar in Thessalonica. Why you have to know all that background stuff? Because when Paul gets to Thessalonica really liked Caesar. And so when you read his interaction with people in Thessalonica in Acts 17:1 through 9, you understand what happened. This itinerant Jewish preacher comes to Thessalonica, starts this little following, and he proclaims Jesus, this crucified guy, as king. And from a Thessalonican perspective, that's a threat to Caesar. And so he gets in trouble, and he has to basically leave Thessalonica in the dead of night to save his own butt, leaving the small Christian community in Thessalonica to fend for itself. And so, if you know that background, then when we come to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, you'll understand the situation that Paul was dealing with. He had to leave quickly, and he was worried about this church that he had just started. He was worried that they might think he was some kind of charlatan who just bailed as soon as it got tough. And so what he does is, right after he left Thessalonica, when he eventually made his way to Corinth, he sent Timothy back to Thessalonica to check in on them while he stayed in Corinth. And then, when Timothy came to give the good news that they were standing strong, he writes this letter, 1 Thessalonians, to encourage them and thank them, all that stuff. And then shortly after that, he writes another one to clarify a few things that they had misunderstood from the first letter. So that's the background. So when you read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, you have to keep that historical background in mind to make more sense of it. Okay? Now, when we get to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, there are really 4 main issues. One, it's up front. Sorry about my nose itching. The cold weather. The first issue is Paul's legitimacy. And you see that really at just the beginning of 1 Thessalonians. He's writing to them to reassure them that he really is legit. He didn't bail on them. He really wants them to know that. That's the first issue. The second issue is he's encouraging them in the midst of their tribulation. I'm going to say something about that in a little bit. But that's you when you read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, you really get that. They're going through some tough times as a Christian community in Thessalonica, and he's writing to encourage them. The third thing, main issue, happens to deal with the coming of Christ, the day of the Lord. I think I mentioned this at some point, the parousia of Christ, and I'll tease out what that means again. And the fourth thing is encouraging them to live holy lives. Those 4 things really are what 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are about. Now, turning to 1st Thessalonians, chapter 1 is just is basic greeting to them and a basic thanksgiving that they're doing well. Now, a couple of things to know, not just for this letter, but throughout the New Testament. There's a couple of Greek words that you really need to know because they have a specific meaning, and too often people generalize them. Tribulation, which translates as tribulation, sometimes suffering, the Greek word is thlipsis. If you want to write that down, Thlipsis. Thlipsis. That word, we mostly translate either suffering or tribulation, is almost always used in the New Testament to describe what Christians go through. Basically, if you're a Christian, you should expect to endure some amount of thlipsis, tribulation, suffering. Okay? And so the church in Thessalonica was undergoing some kind of tribulation. So that's what he's writing. Okay? And so he's encouraging them in the midst of their tribulation to stand firm. Now, another word that he uses in chapter 1 is wrath. The Greek word is orge. We get that from ogre. Wrath has a very specific meaning as well. Basically, wrath, from a New Testament perspective, is what God will bring upon those who inflict tribulation on his people. Okay? So, Christians get thlipsis. They will endure tribulation. Those who do that will get God's wrath at, and here's the big thing, at the coming of Christ. The parousia of Christ. All right? And I think I talked about that in one of our classes earlier. But basically, it means the coming of Christ, the parousia of Christ, is a king's entrance into the city to be crowned as king after a big victory. Okay, that's what that word normally means. And it's being applied to Christ. Now the question is, what did Paul have in mind when he's talking about the coming of Christ or the day of the Lord? We automatically think oh, it's the second coming of Christ that still hasn't happened yet in 2021. And there is that ultimate aspect to it, the consummation of everything. But in the first century, we have to think of there must be something concrete that he's referring to. And oftentimes, the day of Christ, the coming of Christ, the day of the Lord, that has its roots in the Old Testament day of Yahweh language, where when God comes to act on behalf of his people, when he brings wrath upon his enemies, he's going to bring salvation to his people who have been undergoing suffering. When that happens, that's the day of the Lord. And I think that this is a big big debate in scholarly circles. I tend to think that when Paul and other New Testament writers talk about the day of the Lord, the coming of Christ, what have you, they have in mind what Christ prophesied about in Mark 13, Matthew 24, Luke 21, the Olivet Discourse, when Christ basically said, the temple's going to be destroyed, Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, God's wrath is going to come upon these people because they will have persecuted and killed me, and they will be persecuting my followers. And so there's that big upending idea is all throughout Jewish history, it was assumed that Gentiles would get God's wrath and Jews would be vindicated on the day of the Lord. But Christ is saying, the day of Christ, my fellow Jews are going to suffer God's wrath because they will have turned out to be rejecting me. And my followers are the true people of God. They will be vindicated. Okay? So, all that said, if that's true, here we are in 50-51. Paul is writing to these Thessalonian Christians about their tribulation at the hands of their countrymen, their Gentile countrymen who are persecuting them. They're going through the same kind of tribulation that the Christian Jews in Jerusalem and Judea at that time were going through at the hands of Jews. And Paul is saying, at the coming of Christ, whether you're a Gentile Christian or a Jewish Christian, you're going to be vindicated, and your oppressors will suffer God's wrath. Okay? And I think on a certain level that was seen as happening in the Jewish War of 70 AD. But there's an extra aspect to that we'll tease out in the other letters. Keep that in mind. Okay. After that in chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3, he defends his ministry. He tells them he wants to come and see them again. And he encourages them by saying, you're my crown, you're my cause for boasting that I will have before Christ at his coming. So when all this gets wrapped up, I'm going to be so proud of you, basically. Now, chapter 4 and 5 contains a very controversial passage, all right, or misunderstood passage. He starts off in chapter 4 by encouraging them to stay faithful, don't go back to their pagan ways. But then, starting in chapter 4:13, all the way into chapter 5, they had some questions. What would happen if some Christians died before the coming of the Lord? What would happen to the Christians who've died? And Paul addresses that concern. And this, he addresses it by basically saying, at the coming of Christ, at the parousia, I can never say that word. At the coming of Christ, the dead in Christ will rise. They will be resurrected, and they will come out with those who are still alive at the time. Obviously, everybody's alive once you're resurrected. But they will go out to welcome Christ as King, and they will rule forever. Okay. Now, if you read that passage, and if you've grown up in an evangelical culture, you tend to read that passage as this is about a rapture, and that it's thrown into the end time speculation of. Long story short, the basic end time scenario is this: we're going along in our lives, then all of a sudden, it's believed that a rapture is going to happen, and they get it from this passage, where the Christians alive on the earth will be whisked away to heaven for 7 years, and then for those 7 years, there's going to be a 7-year tribulation period, and during that time an Antichrist will come, and all hell on earth will happen. And then after 7 years, Christ will come back with those people who had been raptured 7 years earlier, and he's going to come and defeat the Antichrist, and then everything will be great. There's more to it than that. But if you've grown up listening to the Left Behind series, or like me, the Hal Lindsey stuff in the 70s and 80s, that's kind of the end time scenario. The only problem is no Christian up until the mid-1800s ever read this passage to be about a secret rapture. The idea of a rapture is kind of a modern invention that never was held in most of church history. Most people throughout church history, when they read this passage, they thought this is about the second coming, not about the rapture. And that's one of the things people don't realize. They think the rapture and the second coming are the same thing. No. The rapture is the idea that Christians will be whisked away 7 years before the second coming. But when you read this, it's quite clear that Paul is saying, at Christ's coming, if you've died and you're a Christian, you will be resurrected because Christ was resurrected, and we're all going to live in God's new creation together. Okay? That's what his point is in that passage. And I wanted to go over that more in class, but snow days are preventing us. But we'll entertain questions about that next time we meet. But that's basically 1 Thessalonians. 2 Thessalonians is a shorter letter, a lot of the same themes, and the biggest thing to focus on is in chapter 2, 1 through 12, where some of the Thessalonian Christians apparently thought that the coming had already happened, and they were worried, like, what's going on? And Paul is writing to them, and he's reassuring them, Christ's coming has not happened yet. Certain things have to happen first, and if you read 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, it's really obscure. It's nobody who really is absolutely sure what he's talking about. But Paul tells them that Christ hasn't come yet. The rebellion must happen first. A man of lawlessness must arise. He's a son of destruction. Right now, the lawless one is being held back by somebody, and I've told you about that already. That's what he says. Doesn't tell us. The mystery of lawlessness is already at work. And when Jesus comes, he will kill the lawless one with the breath of his mouth. And then, yeah, what does that mean? There's, speculation. On one hand, because I really tried to read these first century documents in light of the first century, and I really think the upcoming Jewish war was a big deal. So it's possible that the rebellion he's talking about is the Jewish revolt that he said is going to happen, just like Jesus said it's going to happen. That's one possibility. The lawless one, that's anybody's guess. Maybe it could be some Jewish religious figure who helped in the revolt. Some people think it might be Nero, because we do know about Nero. Early part of his reign was actually a really good time for Rome, because he was advised by, I believe it was Seneca. But then once Seneca retired, that's when Nero went nuts. And so some people read that in here, but we don't know. That's really all you need to know for 1 and 2 Thessalonians. That's the big thing. When you read 1 and 2 Thessalonians, understand the historical setting of what he was doing in Acts 17 to bring about the writing of the letters. And the really big thing you have to know about 1 and 2 Thessalonians is the idea of tribulation, wrath, what the coming of Christ means. And then in 1 Thessalonians 4:13 and beyond, that Paul is talking about the dead in Christ resurrecting at Christ's coming. He's not talking about a secret rapture before an end-time 7-year tribulation. He doesn't even mention a 7-year tribulation. That should tell you something. One of the problems with some of the ways people interpret things in the New Testament is they cherry-pick verses. They'll take a couple verses from Daniel over here, this passage in 1 Thessalonians over here, a couple things in Revelation, and they stir them up all into a pot, and they say, this is what it means. And that's where we get that left behind end times speculation. But the problem is you shouldn't read anything, let alone the Bible, with just cherry picking verses and mixing them up. You have to understand each one of those passages on their own, in their own context. And when you read this first and second Thessalonians, there's none of that 7-year tribulation period stuff that's going on. It's not in there. Paul's talking about at Christ's coming, the dead will rise and we'll all reign with him. Okay, hopefully this won't be too long. If we meet Wednesday, I'll entertain any thoughts on 1 Thessalonians, and we'll just keep going on to where whatever's next, and we'll kind of assess from there. All right. Obviously, you don't have an assignment for Thessalonians. I gave you 3 points. So please read 1 and 2 Thessalonians on your own. Take note of the things I just told you. Read the textbook. Get the main points down for yourself, and then we'll go from there. All right.